And now to our first conversation. Nigerian fintech companies raised a venture capital funding of about $1.2 billion. That's in 2022, followed by Kenyan fintech, who raised about $1.1 billion. And Egypt coming in third with $820 million. In Lagos alone, about 107 technology startups raised funding to the tune of $750 million in 2022. Well, let's get a sense of what's to come in 2023 with Adebola Omololu, CEO, co-founder, Get Funded Africa. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Great to have you, and
Thank you for
happy
having
New
me.
Year.
Same to you.
So quite impressive numbers.
Very
we saw,
impressive.
In 2022. How did that fare compared to 2021? Obviously an upgrade.
It's an upgrade, and the research team at Get Funded Africa are telling me that Africa was one of the few continents that actually had an increase in venture capital funding in 2022. Most of the other continents saw a kind of like pullback. Now, for Africa, in a way, there was a slowdown, correctly, but vis-a-vis pretty much everyone else, there was an increase on the African continent. You have to realize that on the African continent, funding for startups has been growing on average about 250% on average on a year-on-year basis. However, last year it grew slower, but unlike others, it actually still grew.
So having a slow pace, and that was like the later part of 2022.
Yeah.
Is that a sign of things to come?
Yes and no, because the beginning of the year, it took off like, a race. Funding the first half of 2022 was at an accelerated pace. However, by the second half of the year, it slowed down, primarily due to the global economic crisis, fears of recession, among several other things. However, 2023 has started off very interestingly. I should say, just yesterday, one of the startups, a Tunisian startup specifically, InstaDeep, run by my friend Karim, they actually sold, their company got purchased, InstaDeep got purchased for almost slightly over $700 million. That's just one company, but that gives, it kind of like shows you what's to come. Because essentially, one of the key factors for funding is investors want to make sure that down the line, they can actually exit. And so when InstaDeep exits for over $700 million, it immediately tells people that, hey, Africa is here for business. And this is one of the factors that we think are going to form, what to come in Africa and funding in startups in 2023.
And, I was speaking to my colleague, earlier in 2022, you hear this company, fintech company, this startup raised about $500,000. This one's raising $1 million. So I'm wondering, how easy is it to raise these funds, or how hard is it?
Funding is very, very tough, and it is very difficult, and it also takes time. The reality is that, many people say, hey, they're raising this, they raised this, and all. The thing is, for funding, you actually have to have a good business. So many people come to Get Funded Africa and say, hey, can you help us raise funds? And we, first of all, have to assess that company. And so what we've done instead is to provide tools to actually build that company up, because it is when you build the company that investors actually start coming. So just now I talked about the Tunisian company that was purchased, 100% purchased for over $700 million. Now, the company that purchased them is this vaccine maker, BioNTech. InstaDeep is an AI company, so slightly different industries. However, BioNTech had been part of their investors because they saw that this company could help them in creating their vaccines faster. And so what happens is that you have to be providing a value or a service, or there's something that an investor sees in you that even affects them. And so you have to build your business in order to attract funding. So a lot of companies that have attracted funding, some of them are playing in industries that there's a lot of development required in there, and investors are willing to put their funds in. And some of them, it's really just a question of interest in what solution they're actually providing. And so funding is not easy. you have to develop a lot of things, build up your business, and then by extension, the funding kind of like then comes by virtue of building your business.
Because obviously, when an investor comes to to fund your business or help you raise funds, is it every investor you accept? As a startup, do I just you want to give me money? I take it. What do the startups have to look out for to make sure that this is the right investor, this is the kind of person I should work with or not?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's something that we advise a lot of the startups that we work with. Essentially saying that, look, yes, you need money to grow and all, but it's very important for you as a startup to even select the investors that you want. Many people would come and throw money at you. The reality is that, and I say this with all intent, there are more funds available than even people that want them. There are trillions, and I didn't use the word billions, trillions of dollars available for investment. But that startup needs to be investor ready. Now, it also means that that startup needs to select the right kind of investors that would help to grow their business. It's not just the money you need. You also need the advice. You need the mentorship and the people that would dedicate time in order to grow that business. And so it's very, very important that whatever startup, whatever business you're in, you're actually selecting the right kind of investor from a financial perspective, yes, but also from an advice, mentorship, and all those other small things around it that can actually help the business to grow and develop.
And obviously we have so many people out there looking for funds to start their business. What would you tell such a person trying to attract funding, but they can't even get funding at this time?
There are multiple stages. You have different types of businesses. I like to say that in Get Funded Africa, we work with SMEs and startups. A startup is an SME, but the difference is that a startup is a fast-growing SME. Now, a startup means that that business is growing quickly. So it means that investors are more willing to take the risk of putting funds in to that business so that it can grow. The last thing an investor wants is to invest into a company and then, it becomes like The Walking Dead, right? They want to see that consistent growth. And so if a startup or an SME has an idea and they can actually take that idea to the next level, that helps the investor know, hey, look, this company, they've got something going on and we can actually grow and scale. And you see that happening now more and more with specific markets. So you have the top, the top ones and then the outliers. So Nigeria is now, it is Africa's largest economy on one hand, and by extension has attracted the largest amount of funding into Africa as a whole. On average, Nigerian startups attract anything from, over the last 4 years, anything from 20% to about 35% of the funding on the African continent. In 2022, Nigerian startups attracted about 25% of investment into African startups. It was, as you rightly said, the data aligns with the GFA research team of give or take about 1.2. It's still going to be coming in because usually what happens is that the investors would then say, hey, these are the companies that we invested in. So there's a lag time usually of about 30 to 45 days. But what we see is that Nigerian investment into Nigerian startups we expect it to hit about 1.3 to 1.4 billion dollars.
Are we getting more of that funding in Africa just because we're the biggest economy?
It's not just that. It's the fact that, we have a huge market and there are many problems. So the more problems
are good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more problems you have, side by side with that, is the more opportunities. We talk a lot about fintech companies. And one of the reasons is because the percentage of, there's a huge percentage of unbanked Nigerians. And this is in Nigeria and even across Africa. There's a large number of unbanked people. And the challenge is, of course, for many of the banks, there are specific regulations that they have to follow, and so that bars them or stops them from actually onboarding many people. However, many of the fintechs who are not actually held by some of those regulations or rules are able to actually go out there and onboard people. So what it means is that it's a problem for some people, they don't have bank accounts, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for a fintech, for example, to go out there and get things. And it's not just fintech. There are huge opportunities in the healthcare industry. We saw huge investments in the healthcare industry in 2022, almost 100. So again, even though the general growth rate in 2022 slowed down from an African perspective, still increased. However, if you look at specific industries, there were huge jumps. In the healthcare industry, there was a huge jump in investment. In the AI sector of things, there was a huge jump in investment. And even in ecosystem builders, surprisingly, like Get Funded Africa itself, there was also a huge jump in investment. That grew almost like 280%. So, and in different countries, we have, I started off by saying, okay, you have Nigeria, you have Egypt, you have Kenya, and you have South Africa. Let's call them the tier one, for lack of a better word, let's call them tier one funding destinations. And then you now have another set of destinations that are growing and growing very quickly. So you have countries like Ghana, you have Tanzania, you have Uganda, to mention a few. And then there are some up and coming ones as well, you know, the likes of Botswana and Tunisia as well, that are coming up. And all of this, the entire ecosystem is affected by the concerns of the investors in terms of what's the size of the market, what's the ability to cross-sell into other markets, other things like what's the growth rate, and even regulation. Nigeria passed the startup bill in 2022. Sorry, I worked with it for so long, I'm so used to calling it startup bill.
Right.
Now the Startup Act.
Right.
And now joins countries like Tunisia. And again, you're seeing the effect of what has happened in Tunisia just because of the regulation and the framework that has been created for startup funding and for startup growth. So regulation and government also plays an important part in attracting funding. We have several multilateral institutions across the continent, just across the world actually. Right. The likes of the Dutch KfW in Africa, the Africa Development Bank, who last year came together and committed to over $80 billion over the next 5 years in terms of investment into startups. So when I said that there is more money than startups available.
I'm talking about, you know, more money. You know, I did see that headline earlier. A big, you know, investor kind of like got scammed, you know, by a startup. They kind of played up the number of users, you know, of their platform, and they didn't have any users. So how are you able to, you know, spot such inconsistencies before making an investment?
So this is from the investor side. Many investors take their time to actually understand the business of the startup and actually see what it is that the company does and all. And they do a lot of things based on trust, whilst of course also verifying. It is just the way the system works. Some businesses fail. That is just how it is. And some fail in a spectacular way, where they have been untruthful in terms of building their own business and the numbers and everything that they project. The beauty of it, though, is that the way the venture capital system works, at the end of the day, even those that fudge the numbers will always be exposed. So the fact that, you know, there was a big failure is also a testament to how venture capital works, that ultimately, even if you fudge your numbers in order to get investment, you will be exposed and you will be shown out.
Right. All right. So early days, 2023, quite a big number attracted into Nigeria, talking about $1.2 billion. What are we expecting, you know, for 2023 for Nigeria and Africa?
So
the tier one.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about Africa as a whole. And so For Nigeria in particular, our analysts predict that investment into Nigerian startups this year is going to hit about $2.5 billion. And that investment across the African continent is going to be around the $7 billion mark this year. So a growth from about $5 billion that we see, that the numbers tell us as of 2022, to $7 billion in 2023. And there are several factors that will also affect that. One of them I mentioned earlier, which is the ability, or what investors see as the ability to actually exit. And we're already getting pretty good stories in that direction. The size of the market, as well as regulation. We're seeing a lot of activity from previously docile or quiet organizations that should have been actively investing, but we're seeing more activity. So if you say Nigeria, for example, I want to specifically mention the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. They have started, they even started a prize for innovation, and they have been doing this quietly for a while, but they're now actively investing in African-based funds that are also investing in startups. And we're seeing this now more with several sovereign wealth funds across the continent. The Pula Fund in Botswana, the ITHMA Fund in Morocco, and several other countries. Several other sovereign wealth funds are doing so. In addition, remember, investors, typically the way the venture capital industry works is that long-term, people that have long-term funds provide those funds typically for a period of 5 years to 10 years to the venture capital investors, who then take those funds and invest them in the startups, right? And so if you are able to increase the flow into the venture capital companies, by extension, you're able to increase the flow into the startups. Because now we're now seeing that even things like pension funds, in many African countries, you have pension funds, long-term funds. Yeah. And those pension funds typically should be investing in several things and various asset classes. You now have some countries changing their regulations to enable pension funds invest in startups because it is an asset class that typically would grow. There will be some failures, of course.
Right, but 2023
yeah,
looks good. It's starting off
on the right note.
Okay.
It's looking like it's going to grow.
All right.
Especially for Africa, we're coming from a very low base.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, even when we say it's going to hit $7 billion, compare that to the US, where it's probably about $200 billion.
Yeah, and the uncertainties that are still ahead, because we're getting all those gloomy forecasts, from the World Bank, IMF, and all of that. But we'll keep watching, we'll keep tracking this, the African funding raises. Thank you so much, Mr. Adebola Mololu, CEO, Get Funded Africa. It was great having you.
Thank you for having
perspective today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right.